All right, you're going to want to take your notes out. We're due to the fact that the school year is winding down rapidly. We're going to move ahead in our notes to page 6. And we're going to be kind of the middle of the page where it says chapter 24. And we're going to start with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So you probably never heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment before. Perhaps you've heard of Tuskegee. We had the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. Maybe you've heard of the Tuskegee Institute before. So it talks there, 1895, Booker T. Washington. So what happened here is you have these African Americans, 600 black men, 399 who have syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, and 201 do not. And they started to study to see how the disease progresses in humans. And the researchers didn't tell them they had syphilis. They said, you have bad blood. And in exchange for taking part, the men received free medical exams, meals, etc. And it was only supposed to last 6 months, but it actually lasted 40 years until 1972. Well, this isn't going into all the detail, but basically what happened was in the 1940s, we developed penicillin, which could effectively cure syphilis, because back when this started in 1932, there was no cure. And what happens when people had syphilis and it continued to work in their bodies, it could cause blindness and basically wreck their brain. So yeah, 1945 right here, penicillin is accepted as a treatment of choice, but they don't tell these black men that penicillin can cure them. And they were never given the choice of quitting the study, even when they could have been cured. And they even used black people, black medical students. And so it wasn't until Peter Buxton in 1968 who did some, learned from some coworkers that this was going on, and he got involved and tried to bring awareness to it, but they wouldn't end the study. So we'll look at, here's Peter Buxton. And he said, I felt what was being done was very close to an institutional form of murder. It had become an accepted thing within the public health service, not subject to review. So these doctors that he talked to who were in the study, he was trying to get them to stop the study, but they wouldn't. They were too engrossed in their work than they were worried about the people, the African Americans who were in the study. And so finally, after he tried to go through official channels and it got blocked and blocked and blocked, then he continued and leaked the story to the press. And eventually there was congressional hearings, and they shut down the study as a result. And then they didn't really admit wrongdoing. And it's kind of like many of the other problems we've seen in U.S. history, where eventually, years later, they gave the survivors money, and but it was just basically we convicted Nazi scientists for doing experiments on Jews in the Nuremberg trials, and here we were doing experiments on black people, and the doctors and scientists said it was worth it for the glory of science, just like Dr. Mengele, the angel of death, said doing all these studies on Jews was worth it for science. So that same depraved, messed up, racist, this was institutionalized murder. We were killing black people in the name of science. So now you know, and Peter Buxton's a hero. All right, Thurgood Marshall, The Devil in the Grove. So you read an excerpt from this book, and crazy story, right? He goes down into the South to defend some men who were falsely accused, and he actually gets them acquitted. And then as he's trying to leave town, he's basically, stopped by the police, and they arrest him on false charges that he was drunk driving. And then they haul him off down to lynch him. And his friend followed the cop car, even though his friend was commanded by the cop to leave. And they rescue him. And actually, they go back to town, and they happen to get a judge who, instead of putting him in jail where he could be then taken out and lynched, he was set free because the cops had no evidence. Thurgood Marshall obviously was not drunk. And so they, even then, they went back to the black part of town called the Bottom, or the Mink Slide. And then they put Thurgood Marshall in a different car and snuck him out the back way. And they put a different driver in the car he had originally been in, and that driver was stopped and beaten, but Marshall escaped. And it just kind of a view into what was the South like, Jim Crow South like, in the 1950s. Well, anyway, the rest of the book is about the Groveland Four, which was 4 young black men, 3 of them pictured here, who were falsely accused of assault on a white woman. And one of the 4, not pictured here, was shot trying to escape. The other 3, the youngest one being 16, the other 3 were put on trial. The 16-year-old got a life sentence, and the older 2 were convicted of murder by an all-white jury, and they were sentenced to death. And Thurgood Marshall appealed this and said that there was a reason for another trial. And so the 2 older black men were being transported back by this crooked sheriff who had arrested them in the beginning, and he actually used torture to get 2 of the men to confess that they had done the assault, because he literally strung their hands up in the bottom of the police station and beat them with pipes and all kinds of things, and tortured them until 2 of them confessed. One of them refused. Anyway, as they were being transported back by the sheriff to get a new trial, the sheriff shot and murdered one of them and severely injured the other. Also in the process of the trial, one of the NAACP leaders who was fighting for justice for these men, his house was bombed and he was killed, and so was his wife. So only, the youngest one survived, and one of the other men, the one who was wounded by the sheriff, he survived, and eventually it wasn't until very recently, that after they were all dead, that Florida decided that they were innocent. And the lady, the whole thing was a racist mess where 4 innocent men, their lives were ruined by a white woman and the white racist Jim Crow South and a racist sheriff. The book, you read it and it just brings you to tears, and it makes you see why America still has a race problem, because of stories like this that happened in the 1950s. That's not even that long ago. And yeah, that deep-seated racism, that depraved racism still exists. Thurgood Marshall was the most famous black lawyer in the time period, and later he would be the first African American Supreme Court justice. Okay, the next thing there is Plessy versus Ferguson. This is not Plessy versus Ferguson. So remember, in 1896, Homer Plessy was 1/8 black, and he was in Louisiana, I believe, and was convicted because he purposely rode a train car that was designated for whites. And the Supreme Court ruled, I believe 7-1, that separate but equal should exist, which is this farce where they said as long as there's separate accommodations for black people that were equal to what white people had, it was okay to separate them. Legalize racism. And the only one, remember, it was Justice Harlan was the only one who dissented, and he said that the Constitution is colorblind, and just pointed out that this was racist. That's what he said. This is racist. So you remember we went through that Supreme Court case earlier in the school year, and hopefully you remember Justice Harlan's name. So that was Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. And Thurgood Marshall was part of a team trying to overturn that, specifically in education. So court cases were ongoing in the 50s, working towards that. So let's just talk about how that case was overturned here a minute. So in May 17, 1954, so we just celebrated the anniversary of that a few days ago. May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court rules in a decision called Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. A student there, I believe her name was Linda Brown, tried to go to an all-white school and was denied. They took the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation in school is unconstitutional, overturning the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. And Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney in that case. And that would begin, or one of the key beginnings to the civil rights movement. I mean, when we talked about the race riots in 1919, like East St. Louis, we said really that was the beginning when black veterans came home from World War I and said, we're not going to take this racist stuff anymore. That really started, in my opinion, that's what started the civil rights movement. But what really kick-started the change in the 50s was Brown v. Board in 1954, May 17, 1954. And that was the Chief Justice at the time was Earl Warren, who was recently appointed by Eisenhower. The former Chief Justice, who had just died in 1953, was a supporter of segregation. So, all right, so that's Brown v. Board. I have sit-ins here. So, but we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, the next major event in the civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young teenage boy from Chicago. He was down in Mississippi visiting relatives, I believe. And kind of on a dare, he interacted with a white woman, a married white woman. And as a result of that, he was later picked up, kidnapped essentially, by a couple of white men. He was beaten severely. His eye was gouged out, so tortured. And then he was murdered, and his body was wired to a heavy cotton gin fan, and he was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. And then his body was found days later, severely decomposed, and they identified him, I think, by a ring he had. Well, they wanted just to, quickly bury his body in the South. But his mother, pictured here in a Time magazine photo, didn't want that. She asked for the body to be brought back to Chicago, I believe. And then she had his body displayed open casket. So a lot of times if a body is badly burned or in a bad accident or something like that, they'll have the funeral and the visitation will be closed casket. So people can't see the body because the mortician can't do anything about it. But she wanted everyone to see what these white murderers, racists, had done to her son. And so his mangled body was put on display. And that's actually the bottom. This is a cropped photo. The bottom of the photo is they're looking down at Emmett Till's body, decomposed, tortured, beaten body. And so it's one of Time magazine's most influential pictures of all time. The photo was originally taken by, I think, Jet magazine, which is an African-American magazine. They did a full write-up on his murder and including images of his body. So I say this is a key event in civil rights history because it actually motivated Rosa Parks. She said she was inspired by the bravery and courage of Emmett Till's mother, the way that she endured her son's murder and then had the courage to display his body open casket so that everyone would know what they did to her son. And so Rosa Parks was a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, and 70% of the bus riders were African American, and the buses were segregated. The front of the bus was for white people, the back of the bus was for black people. Now, obviously, this picture is not taken the day that she was arrested, but the bus was crowded. She was in the black section, but to me, it sounds like she was in the first seat in the black section of the bus. And the white section filled up. And so then they wanted to kick out all the black people, including Rosa Parks, in the next row to effectively make that next row part of the white section as well. So the white people had a place to sit. And she refused. The other black people moved. She refused. So she was arrested. And so then that was December 1, 1955. Then Martin Luther King Jr. got involved, a young black minister who was willing to use Rosa Parks' arrest to start a nonviolent protest where black people would boycott riding the buses. And he said, "We will use the weapon of love. White people have been taught to hate, and we can't hate them back. We must love and thus nonviolent protest, not ride the bus. No black people ride the bus." You saw in the video I had you watch where black people were walking to and fro to work, etc., refusing to ride the buses, which severely hurt the city's bus economy. And so it took over a year for the court systems to finally rule that segregated buses were unconstitutional, and this was a victory in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, later in the 1950s, would move to Detroit, Michigan, where she would live for decades, working for the NAACP and other civil rights causes. Okay, let's go back. This was Sitins, so that's on the bottom of page 6. So young African-American students, they had a desire to do something for the civil rights movement. It's like, but what can we do? So one of the things they started doing is they started going to these restaurants that refused to serve black people. So the way that things worked in segregated America for African Americans was you'd go to a restaurant and they would not allow black people to be served or eat inside. So you could order your food usually through a counter in the back where it's like a walk-up window. And so what the black people began to do, especially black students, so black young people, is they would go, and there were white people who participated too. They would go into these restaurants and they wouldn't get served. The restaurants refused to serve them food, but they would just sit there as a protest, taking up occupancy. And so pretty soon this spread like wildfire. And so there were sit-ins in over 100 different cities. Initially, the NAACP thought that the students might lose their cool because white people would attack them or do things to them or say things. They were afraid the students might respond with violence, but that didn't happen. And so they were effective at bringing national awareness to segregation. And that was a key part of the civil rights movement was with the advent of the TV, people would watch the news and see these things instead of just being in a newspaper. It brought life to these civil rights issues. Okay. All right, the Little Rock crisis. You saw this on the video I showed as well. And so you have the Little Rock nine students who wanted to desegregate this public school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor, Orville Faubus was his name, great name, Orville Faubus, refused to allow these students into the school. And so you had these massive white mobs, as you saw in the video, surrounding these black students. And this student, Elizabeth Eckford, kind of got separated. And so this was in 1957. So 2,000 white students were in the school. And, but yeah, like I said, Orville Faubus was determined to win re-election for himself. And so he did that by advocating to the white supremacists, the racists. So he ordered troops from the National Guard to prevent these 9 African-American students from entering the school. And obviously the mobs intimidated, and this was on TV. And he would decide to make this stand for segregation and racism. You remember seeing in the video, one of the things that really startled me. So General Eisenhower called in the 101st Airborne to escort these students. I mean, this is the 101st Airborne, right? The heroes of World War II. Asked them to escort these students to school. And that white lady who had been one of the protesters, I think she's directly behind, I don't think she's this lady here. I think she's directly behind Eckford's head, but I'm not sure. But if you remember her from the video, when the 101st Airborne arrived, she said, that was true fear when the 101st Airborne. And I'm like, woman, are you crazy? You formed this hateful white mob around 9 high school students, and obviously they were fearful, right? That was fear. You were in a huge mob. Like, why you? I don't know. I just was disgusted by. It didn't look to me like she was very repentant of her racist actions. Okay, so Eisenhower is willing to use the 101st Airborne to overrule a state governor, Orville Faubus, and what's what I'm looking for, to enforce the desegregation Brown v. Board decision. So that was a huge deal. I mean, Eisenhower had to enforce the Supreme Court decision. All right, this woman, Fannie Lou, was another hero of the civil rights movement, specifically looking at trying to get African Americans to vote again. So if you remember when we talked about the Reconstruction era, we talked about how after the 15th Amendment was passed, African Americans voted. They actually put black men into Congress. Hiram Revels, for example, took Jefferson Davis's seat in Mississippi. But then after that, after the Ku Klux Klan and the failure of Reconstruction, black people were basically intimidated and threatened to not vote, not even to register to vote. And so black voting in the South was basically non-existent. And so this woman tried to rally people to register to vote in this time period. And so she was evicted from her farm for registering to vote. And then later, when she was encouraging other people to register to vote, she was arrested, she was beaten, but she stood fast for the right for black people, according to the 15th Amendment, to vote. All right, another thing you saw in the video was the Freedom Riders. So students, young people, college age, etc., would hop onto buses and they would go specifically to places in the South where the bus stations were segregated, where the bus station waiting areas. And they called themselves the Freedom Riders. So this was in 1961, and they head to places like Birmingham, Alabama, which were extremely racist, led by Bull Connor. And Bull Connor told his people, you need to beat these riders so they look like a bulldog got a hold of them. So they firebombed the bus and they beat the people that were doing the freedom riding. You saw video and pictures of that. But again, this is bringing in national attention, right? You see a bus on fire, you see people beaten who didn't do anything besides ride the bus and get off at, and try to, really didn't even get to the white waiting area. And people's awareness is raised. Next major issue, James Meredith. So he was an African-American college student, and he was trying to transfer to college. And he applied for a transfer to the University of Mississippi. And up to that point, the university had avoided complying with the Supreme Court ruling, ended segregated education. So this is in 1962, and he had a court order directing the university to register him for classes. The governor of Mississippi, Barnett, so you see his name there in the newspaper, blocked him. And this is what he said. He said, "Never will we surrender to the evil and illegal forces of tyranny." It's tyranny to allow a black person to go to college in Mississippi. Ridiculous, depraved racism. And so eventually JFK, who was president in the early 60s, sent in 500 federal marshals, and this huge white mob forms, and they start throwing rocks and bricks and all kinds of stuff at the federal marshals, wounding 160 of them. And so then Kennedy has to send in thousands of troops, and Meredith is escorted the entire year by federal troops to and from his classes to protect him. So Eisenhower protected students in Little Rock, and now Kennedy is doing it for this college student in Mississippi. But you just see the extent these Southern governors are going to enforce segregation. Well, even after, so what Martin Luther King Jr., who was kind of obviously the leader of the civil rights movement, what he wanted was, like in the James Meredith situation with the Freedom Riders, etc., was bring attention to the civil rights movement and then have Congress pass a civil rights act that forced segregation to end by a law of Congress. And that didn't happen after the Meredith situation. And so him and his advisors, they're like, we need to do something to bring back attention to the civil rights movement so that Congress is forced to do something. And so they went back to Birmingham, based because they knew Bull Connor, this guy here, who was in charge of the city of Birmingham. They knew he was this passionate, depraved, white supremacist, racist, and they knew that they could provoke him to these reactions that would bring attention back to the civil rights movement. And so sure enough, they go and they demonstrate in Birmingham, nonviolent demonstrations. And Bull Connor brings out the fire department. They hit him with these fire hoses. You saw that in the video, getting hit with this powerful stream of water, knock you right off your feet. Women, children, old people didn't matter. And then these attack dogs, these German shepherds, were set on innocent protesters. And Martin Luther King Jr. himself was arrested and put in solitary confinement, where he wrote one of his most famous writings, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I'm going to read that, just bits and pieces of it, to give an idea of how he was rallying people to this cause. So he said, my dear fellow clergymen, Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers. As in so many past experiences, our hopes have been blasted. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our cause before the conscience of the local and national community. You may well ask, why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis that a community is forced to confront the issue. So he wanted Kennedy and Congress to confront the issue with the Civil Rights Act. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This is wait. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Perhaps it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging dark of segregation to say, wait. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. One may ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws but obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. It's kind of what Henry David Thoreau said during the Mexican War. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was practiced superbly by early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions rather than to submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. I've heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshipers to comply with desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers declare, file this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. We will reach the goal of freedom all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. So, because of the passion of Martin Luther King Jr., his fearless leadership, his eloquence, and the brave people of Birmingham who participated in the nonviolent protest, this did urge J.F. Kennedy and the Congress to pursue a Civil Rights Act. But we will look at that in the next video.